Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Allison Fitzgerald Kojak. I am the Washington Investigations Editor at the Associated Press, and I am the 112th President of the National Press Club. Our guest today, Marianne Williamson, is a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. And politics is a departure for Williamson, who has spent half a lifetime as an author, activist, and non-denominational faith leader. For over 30 years, she's been speaking, writing, and working about the intersection of spirituality and politics. She's the author of 14 books, 4 that reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, including her most recent, A Politics of Love, a handbook for the new American Revolution. She's founded several nonprofit organizations, including the Peace Alliance and Project Angel Food, a nonprofit that's delivered millions of meals to ill, homebound Americans since 1989. She joins us here to detail one of her signature policy proposals, the creation of a cabinet-level United States Department of Peace. Please join me in welcoming to the National Press Club, Ms. Marianne Williamson.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your being here. This is quite a historic building. Thank you, Allison. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak to you. As I was walking through the hallway, there were all these very historic photographs and these buttons from all these past presidential campaigns. And one is a button from the campaign of a comedian, an American comedian named Pat Paulson. I think that was back in the 70s. And this is such a fabulous line that someone told me. He was famous for having said during his campaign, "The American people want a president who is smart and strategic and on their side." To which I say, picky, picky, picky. I thought that was just great. The truth of the matter is, as much as political humor is a long part of the American historical landscape, all the way back to the beginning. That same landscape has had very, very serious times, and I would say that this is one of them. I want to begin by saying that Barack Obama is basically the last American president who had the luxury of seeing the world through the lens of 20th century mindset. The 21st century is a different world. It's a different mindset than the 20th. And the 20th century, in the same way, was a very different mindset than the 19th. The American people are just fine. The American people are forward-thinking. The American people are regenerative. This is part of our national character. So the American people get that the world is different now in every single area, in business, in education, in health and wellness, in religion and spirituality, in psychotherapy, in every area. The Americans are on the move. They know that if something's not working on Wednesday, we got to change it before Saturday. The problem, as I see it, is not with the American people. At the same time, when it comes to our political establishment, that's not regenerative. It's not on the move. It's not forward-thinking, and it has very little to do with a 21st century mindset. Rather, it is stuck. It is stuck, and it is corrupted, quite frankly. It is under the sway of a very 20th century mindset. And that 20th century mindset at this moment, and this has been true for decades, is infiltrated by the undue influence of money, specifically corporate money, on our public policy. Now, closing that gap between the consciousness or the will of the American people and the way our government operates is the moral and political task of our time. That's what's supposed to happen in a representative democracy. The whole point is that the government is here to represent the will of the people, and it is certainly here in order to advocate for the health and well-being and safety of the American people. Well, nobody here is under the illusion that that is what is happening now. Rather, for the last 40 years, we have been sliding away from that, away from a genuine, functioning, vital democracy to what might be called a corporate aristocracy. We all know this. We all know that the short-term profit maximization for health insurance companies, big pharmaceutical companies, oil companies, gas companies, gun manufacturers, defense contractors, et cetera, that has more to, that they wield more power on the functioning of our government than does the concern for the American people. I'm here to talk to you today specifically about one of the ways, and there are many ways, in which that corporate dominance has created tremendous amounts of unnecessary human suffering. And human suffering is what the government should be concerned with. The suffering of the American people, the unnecessary suffering of us, the unnecessary suffering of our children, the unnecessary suffering of other people in the world who are impacted by American foreign policy, and that which is ultimately the suffering of people that will occur if we continue to desecrate the planet itself in ways that we do. There's a famous, a lot of times people talk about famous people's last words. And one of the most interesting to me were the last words of the famous French scientist Louis Pasteur. His last words were this: "I was wrong. It's not the germ, it's the terrain." Now, the 20th century, being dominated by a mindset that's basically a product of Newtonian physics, saw the world as a huge machine. And if you wanted to change things, all you did was tweak things on the outside. And so that 20th century mindset dominates our politics today. And it is why there's no real transformation that emerges from Washington. All that emerges from Washington is a treatment of the symptoms. That's what our policies are about. That is what our policy discussions seem to be about. Our politicians talk to us about changing this policy or changing that policy, but too often the change in policy is disconnected from a recognition of what caused the problem to begin with. The 21st century is far more integrative. The 21st century is far more holistic. In the 21st century, we recognize that it's not just the germ, it's the terrain. It's not just the violence in terms of people's behavior, it's the thoughts and the feelings within people that led to the dysfunctional or malfunctional behavior. So, for instance, you can talk about a domestic level. You can talk about the fact that 100 people are killed by guns every single day. We can talk about the mass shootings. We can talk about all of these horrible statistics regarding gun violence in the United States, and we can talk about a change in our gun safety policy, which I certainly support. Like most Americans, I want universal background checks. Like so many, certainly progressive Democrats, I want the same things that those guys do. I want to outlaw bump stocks. I want to close the gun show loopholes. I want to close the boyfriend loopholes. I want to bring back the ban on military-style assault weapons. And I want to see a change in American foreign policy, which too often is dominated by this obsession almost with the perpetuation of the military-industrial complex and its desire for profit maximization for defense contractors. However, those things of themselves are symptoms. We must ask ourselves, why are we such a violent society? That's why I want a United States Department of Peace. And the United States Department of Peace is very connected also with the United States Department of Children and Youth, and also I believe that my plan for reparations of slavery will also answer a lot of the underlying turbulence that leads to some of the worst aspects and ravages of violent behavior in our society today, including white nationalism. When you look at what we know now, we know things about the brain of a child that they didn't even know 50 years ago. We know how much now happens before the age of 8. How can you talk about gun violence? How can you talk about violence in our society and not even have a conversation about the violence that is perpetrated by so much of our public policy? Our criminal justice system is in many ways as violent as the violent crimes it seeks to prosecute. Our food policies are violent in how many contaminants are in our water, how many toxins are in our air, how many carcinogens are in our food. Our environmental policies are essentially violent in how much violence that they allow to be done to the earth on which we live. Our educational policies are in many ways violent in the sense that if you are withholding a high-quality public school education from any child, particularly given the fact that when that is withheld, it is due to the fact that that child wasn't lucky enough to live in a rich neighborhood, and we have the audacity to base our educational funding primarily on property taxes, that is a passive form of oppression, and that is violent. For that matter, poverty is violent. For that matter, hunger is violent. So this idea that we're going to deal with violence, by building more prisons, we're going to build with fix violence by having tougher gun safety laws. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to look in the mirror as an American society and realize we will be violent until we decide to be nonviolent. All that darkness is the absence of light, and all that violence is the absence of peace. The question for the American people is, are we willing to declare peace? Because if we are willing to declare peace, then we have to take a really good look at the fact that there were 45 million impressions of violence against children last year alone on the internet. if we are seriously interested in dealing with the terrain out of which societal dysfunction and malfunction arises, we need to deal with the fact that 13 million children in America are hungry, that 100,000 children in America are homeless, that almost a third of the American people live in conditions that are near poverty. That is violent. This is where the seeds are, ladies and gentlemen. We should see and we should factor into both our domestic and our international policies the fact that large groups of desperate people are a national security risk. When you have large groups of desperate people, don't go acting like you just have no idea where all that violence came from. Because if people experience violence in accumulated layers of human experience over and over and over again, all that anybody has to do is to look in the profiles of most of the violent perpetrators who are in American prisons today, and you will see what a high number of them were were the victims of violent abuse when they were children. That's why I want all of the issues that we know actually dismantle violence to be brought to the fore of American domestic policy. Conflict resolution, restorative justice. We need trauma-informed education. We need community wraparound services. We need mental health services, not only for our children, but also for their families. We need mindfulness in the schools. We need anti-bullying. We need violence prevention in the schools. Washington doesn't look underneath the waterline. It talks about policy, but it doesn't talk about people. The next time a bunch of congressmen or senators are taking one of their jaunts to the Middle East, which I certainly support, but I would like them to take another jaunt, I don't know, maybe to the inner city of Los Angeles, or to Chicago, or to Gary, Indiana. 40% of all of the girls in the public schools of Chicago are deemed to have a form of PTSD that is considered no less severe than the PTSD of returning veterans from Afghanistan or Iraq. We have millions of American children living in chronic trauma due to all of the factors that I've mentioned here today. When an American child, and we have this in the richest country in the world, we have millions of American children who go to school every day and ask the teacher if maybe you have some food for me. We have millions of American children who go to school in classrooms that do not even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, then the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. I want to repeat that. The chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Now, we will then perhaps be incarcerating that person for what they did, but isn't the original question what we did? That is why America needs to look in the mirror. The same is true internationally as is true domestically. Our government has become so corrupted by an obsession to advocate for short-term profits for huge multinational corporate entities that the unnecessary human suffering that results from this, the squeeze of people, the economic anxiety, the constant economic tension that millions and millions and millions of people live through, this is the source of the societal dysfunction. And yet this same level of malfunction on the part of how we behave as a society governmentally in terms of policy is mirrored in international affairs. Our national security agenda is dominated, as we all know, basically by a constant perpetuation of war. Let's look at the math. We spend $760 billion in 1 year of our military budget. Our State Department, however, which is mediation and diplomacy and development, they get $40 billion. Now, within that $40 billion, there is $17 billion that goes to the USAID, and USAID is, of course, humanitarian assistance and long-term development. Also within that $40 billion, in addition to the $17 billion, there is less than $1 billion given to the peace-building agencies. And then the U.S. Institute of Peace, the independent agency of the U.S. Institute of Peace, gets something like $38 million. Now, there are 4 factors that constitute what we call peace-building. And a lot of people don't seem to understand what peace-building is. The truth of the matter is that peace-building it exemplifies skill sets and expertise just as sophisticated, just as important, and in many ways, given some of the places where these peace builders are assigned, take just as much courage. There are 4 factors to peace building, which, when present, statistically mean there will be a greater incidence of peace and a lower incidence of conflict. Those 4 factors should not surprise anyone. Number 1, expanded economic opportunities for women. Number 2, expanded educational opportunities for children. Number 3, a reduction of violence against women. And number 4, the amelioration of unnecessary human suffering. All of that should be common sense. All of that is common sense. And yet look how much divergence there is between the common sense of anyone whose heart is even slightly connected to their head is expressed in the way how our government operates. We should see large groups of desperate people, whether we're talking about a corner of an American city or a corner of a far-off country in the world. Large groups of desperate people are a national security risk. Large groups of desperate people are a risk. Why? Because desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces, whether it has to do with gangs in America or it has to do with terrorist organizations somewhere else. And that is why, if I'm president, when elected president of the United States, I want a United States Department of Children and Youth to deal with the horrendous need that we have for a massive realignment of investment in our children. That is the only way to have a peaceful future. And I want a United States Department of Peace in order to coordinate. In both cases, these departments are basically coordinative. We already have the experts in peace building. We already have the experts in social work. We already have the experts in early childhood. We already have the experts in international affairs, people who know the humanitarian assistance that is needed, the expansion of opportunities that are needed. It is simply that this is not what we fund. How can you compare $760 billion to the military and less than $1 billion that is given to our peace-building agencies? It's not so much that we need to bring in new people, ladies and gentlemen. It is that we need to coordinate among the agencies that already exist. And the United States Department of Peace will do just that. The U.S. State Department, the peace-building agencies, the USAID, the long-term development, the humanitarian assistance, all of this should be given equal weight to military. And when I'm president, they will. The head of the USAID should have a seat at the table no less powerful than our Secretary of Defense. We need the equivalent in global society of what already exists in health and healing, the health and wellness space. We've long past evolved beyond the idea that you didn't have to take care of your body, you didn't have to take care of your diet, you didn't have to take care of your nutrition, you didn't have to take care of your illness, and then when sickness arises, which it almost inevitably will, you can just go to a doctor and through allopathic external means hope that the doctor can suppress or eradicate the symptoms. We don't look at healing the body that way anymore, and we shouldn't look at healing the society or the planet that way anymore either. And so we need to cultivate peace, not just be prepared for war. I see the U.S. military like I see a surgeon. I have great respect for the military. My father fought during World War II. My critique here is not of the military. The decisions that I'm criticizing here are not military decisions, they are political decisions. Every dollar that the military says that they need, they should get. What I'm talking about here, what I think every American should be concerned about, is the hundreds of billions of dollars over and above what the military says they need that has only to do with short-term profit maximization for defense contractors. So if you want to be healthy, you can't just fight disease. You have to cultivate health. Sickness is the absence of health. Health is not the absence of sickness. And if you want a peaceful world, you need to cultivate peace. You can't just fight war. We need to have the best surgeon on hand in case we need surgery. That's what the military should be. But a sane person tries to avoid surgery. That's the kind of paradigm shift that we need. This is not just a shift in policy here or policy there that then can be shifted back with the next president. We need a shift in the thinking of the American people. We need the American people to realize that one of the reasons we have so much violence on our streets, one of the reasons we have so much violence in our world is because our government is now so corrupted by the undue influence on corporations that are mainly concerned with their short-term maximization and in a very amoral way do not consider it their job to have to worry about the suffering that emerges because of it. That suffering is what leads to violence in the heart, and violence in the heart is what leads to violent behavior. The American people understand this kind of thing. The American people are not stupid. It is time for the American government to catch up. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Like I said, I'll go to questions in just a few minutes. If anybody who has a question, again, raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you, and identify yourself before you ask the question. That would be helpful. I just want to start off, if you don't mind, with you sell an awful lot of books. You're very well known and very popular, but your candidacy does not seem to have taken off in the same way. Where do you think that disconnect is?
I think the disconnect itself is an illusion. First of all, if you were to say you haven't broken through, I sure as hell did break through. It was called the second debate. And it's because of my popularity after the second debate. It was because of the fact that I was Googled, and more than any other candidate in 49 states, that the political hits began. And everybody in this room knows what that means. You know what a smear is. Let's not act as though we don't know what that means. The illusion, she's anti-medicine, anti-science, neither of which is true. Crazy, dangerous lady, neither of which is true. What you heard today, however, are my ideas, which are indeed disruptive to the status quo. And those who are so attached to the perpetuation of the status quo saw me, and they went, uh-oh, and within 3 days, the smears began. People can see that. So people have continued to come to my talks. People have continued to donate to my campaign. You know, it's interesting because in the last election, the Democratic Party was gobsmacked by the success of Bernie Sanders. The Republican Party was gobsmacked by the success of Donald Trump because neither one could see beneath the waterline. I would think that the Democratic Party would be happy with the fact that I bring so many people who have not been involved in politics before. But when those polls are done, and they're polling likely Democratic voters, people who come to my lectures and my talks and my campaign rallies were not necessarily people who voted in past Democratic primaries, many people who are Republican, many people who are independents. And I also remind you that there will be millions of people voting in this next election who were not even born in the 20th century. So I think first there was an illusion and a mischaracterization of who I am that contributed to the ways in which I have not broken through, and there are other ways in which I sure as heck have broken through, and the same system which would like it not to be true is pretending that it isn't happening.
Now, you just came back from a trip in Iowa. Can
Yes.
you talk a little bit about the reception you've gotten there?
Well, it's so fabulous. You know, when you're in the early primary states, and I'm sure many of you are journalists who are spending time during campaign seasons and probably have for years, it's a real honor to be in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in South Carolina, and Nevada. You know, the things have changed in California now with the early voting there, but I don't get that the average Californian has really integrated that into their thinking in the same way. There are two different political universes. One is the pundits and the polls and the money and the corporate media and the DNC and all of that. That's one universe. And here in Washington, you know all about that. But then there's another political universe that many of you know about as well because you've traveled to these states. And that's what's actually going on the ground in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in South Carolina, in Nevada. And there it is so profound, actually. People in those states know, Iowa specifically, which is what you're asking about, they have the power. MSNBC actually doesn't have the power. CNN doesn't have the power. If Fox doesn't have the power, DNC doesn't have the power, except insofar as they are able to manipulate the views of people in those states. Political establishments, such as political parties, should facilitate the process of democracy, not dictate the process of democracy. So when I'm in Iowa, as I was on my Marianne Mobile, and anybody can go to marianne2020.com, you can go to my Instagram page, my Twitter, my Facebook, go to Instagram, see the pictures of the Marianne Mobile traveling through Iowa. People in Iowa are very smart. They know how much power they have. They know the issues, and they're not concerned with all the hoopla. They want to hear what you've got. And people are showing up. People are listening. I feel we're engaged in a deeper conversation about what is happening in this country, about traumatized children, about economic injustice, about a World War II level of mass mobilization to reverse climate change and change from a dirty economy to a clean economy. They're interested in things like the Department of Peace, changing from a war economy to a peace economy, and they're interested in reparations. So when I'm actually there, it's one of the greatest privileges and honors of my life. And I've been saying recently when asked, I have learned from this experience that the system is even more corrupt than I feared, and the people of the United States are even more wonderful than I knew.
So on that, you were not on the debate stage the last time, and you have been very critical of the DNC for the way that they've run this, and just their role in the election. Can you talk about what you think is wrong with their method of managing the debates?
When you say I was very critical, I don't know about very critical, somewhat critical, definitely.
I just read an article you wrote.
Yes, and I'll be glad to articulate that. And as I just said, I think it should be the purpose of the DNC to facilitate American democracy, not to dictate American democracy. Let's not forget, the Constitution does not even mention political parties, and George Washington warned us against them. To the extent to which they are appropriate, and I believe they are appropriate, they should take a back seat. They should be serving the political process, not in any way dominating the political process. So what happens right now is that these debates, which on a certain level are like a reality TV show, so what's happening right now is that the DNC says, well, there's so many people running, there's so many candidates, we've got to narrow this down. Well, first of all, I don't agree with the premise. I'm someone who thinks it's actually very healthy for the Democratic Party and very healthy for the United States that there are so many people. This is an all-hands-on-deck type of moment, guys. Anybody have any good ideas? If you have a good idea, it's because we really have to win in 2020. We really need to take a new path forward. Anybody have any good ideas? And I know I can say as a candidate, every time any of the candidates have a good idea, I think it ups the game of every other candidate. Now, this idea of limiting the number, I heard one woman say, well, it's like with children. You just can't give them too many choices. And I looked at her and I said, the voters are not children. That's the point. It's so paternalistic. When people have said to me, well, Marianne, what's supposed to limit and narrow the choices? The primaries. That's what they're for. That should be up to the voters. The voters can walk and chew gum at the same time. I've been in Iowa. This is the most consequential election, not just in our lifetime. This is one of the most consequential elections in American history. Give people time to think this through. And particularly if you're a candidate like myself who's outside the box, people have to process this. But I think this is important because the box itself is saturated with corruption and toxicity. People need this time, and in no way should the DNC or any other forces, including corporate media, be trying to manipulate or limit the opportunity of the voter to hear everybody, see everybody, and make their own decision.
Have you found, since you have been stumping on the campaign trail, that members of Congress here in D.C. are interested in what you're saying, or is anyone reaching out to you?
Are they interested in what I have to say, you said?
I said, well, both. Are they interested, and have they shown you their interest by calling you up and saying, talk to me about this?
Well, Congress is not a monolith any more than the media is a monolith. There are very, very wonderful people who I have met in government. Nothing that I'm saying is personal. Even with the other candidates, I'm not running against anyone. I'm running with a lot of really good people. It's the system that is corrupt. And sometimes it's very, very well-intentioned people who become part of the system in both media and government, and it's like you get drawn into it, you get sucked into it. So I don't know. Some people have been very kind. Some people have been kind. I don't know what they're saying after they're kind to me. I don't know. I'm not. This is far too important to be filtering through too much of a personal how I feel about this or that. This is too serious a moment to be even thinking about things on that level.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, Marianne. I'm Nikki Schwab with the Daily Mail. So Donald Trump has said that he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for his work.
He said he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize?
He has said that for first his work in North Korea, but also for his work in Iran and now Syria. What do you say to him?
I'm sorry, you said that people say he deserves it because of what he did with Iran and Syria?
Correct. He says
He
that-
said that.
especially with North Korea.
Poor darling, I don't think he can help himself. So, what the president did, what the president did in Iran is extremely dangerous. He should never have taken us out of the Iran nuclear deal. For all that we know, it seemed to be working. Iran seemed to be complying with all of the strictures that they were given. One of the things that I would do as president is immediately go back to trying to be a part of the Iran deal. He has destabilized the region even more. His increased sanctions in Iran have only caused more and more misery among the Iranian people. He is foolish to think that this will make them turn against their government more because they're absolutely clear about where these sanctions come from. That's number one. In terms of Syria, what he has done is not only equally dangerous, but even more dangerous, certainly to the Kurds. He has caused tremendous suffering already, slaughter even among Kurds. He has created a situation where why would any ally of the United States trust us and think that we were going to be there for them as we had promised? These are people who, as we all know, had fought at our side, had been loyal partners. What has happened now will probably have consequences that we cannot even imagine. In terms of the prisoners that have been let go, in terms of ISIS fighters, this is terrible what he has done in Syria. By the way, if anybody out there thinks he's bringing them home, those boys aren't coming home. They were just sent to Iraq. Let's be very, very clear. This president does not deserve a peace prize for either of those things. He possibly, however, deserves impeachment.
Ms. Williamson, Stephen Lee from Bloomberg Environment. I was wondering if you could talk about climate change. What would be the number one item that you would take on to combat climate change?
First thing I would do is make sure that the Environmental Protection Agency is headed by world-class environmental scientists, or Jay Inslee, whichever is available. We need the ex-chemical company executives to be gone. We need the ex-lobbyists for the oil companies to be gone. And the EPA needs to become a magnet for world-class environmental science. We have a situation where if we do not act, and act quite radically, I must say, within the next 12 years, we could have within the next 15 or 20 years a level of social collapse unseen in the modern era. We could be on the way to a situation in which whole swaths of countries, possibly even whole swaths of continents, are uninhabitable because of the heat. Then that means, of course, that food cannot be grown there. That means economic collapse. It means massive food shortages, and it means levels that could possibly be up to the hundreds of millions of environmental refugees. Right now, we already have a terrible environmental crisis, over 63 million people who have been displaced. You think there's an environmental refugee crisis now, just wait to see what would happen then. We need nothing short of a World War II level mass mobilization to reverse climate change. Not only do we need to sequester the carbon, we need to reforest, we need to develop new forms of clean energy, and we also need to deal with that animal factory farming, because even if we did anything else, we would still have the same level of problem because of the nitrous oxide and the methane if we do not deal with that. Now, it's interesting on this because a few years ago we were all talking about the Paris Climate Accords, and we were saying, of course, a Democratic president has to get back into them. That today seems almost quaint. That's like only step one. And now we're going through the same kind of transition regarding the Green New Deal. Rejoining the Paris Climate Accords are the least of what we need to do, and now, to be honest, a Green New Deal is almost not just the least of what we need to do, but that of itself will not go far enough. We need an enrollment unlike anything we have seen since World War II. There are two main issues. First of all, the people, the institutions, and the industries that have done industrial scale harm to the earth, we need those industries to now help us do industrial scale repair of the earth. And we have to admit, there was a time when the use of fossil fuels, people didn't know, and it did not seem illegitimate at all. We would not have fought World War II without the use of fossil fuels. So it's very important that this be a just transition. And one of the things I feel I bring to the table is the ability to navigate systems carefully. The question that lies before us, the challenge that lies before us in terms of our need to move from a dirty economy to a clean economy is similar to many areas. We need change, but we can't have chaos. We've already seen what a chaotic president does. We need fundamental change, but we need someone who can navigate this change in a non-chaotic way. One of the things that this has to do with is a genuine and tender respect for the thousands and thousands of people who now make their living in fossil fuel-related industries, so that they understand they have a president who has their back. We need your creativity. We need your research and development. We need your manufacturing skills. They need to be repurposed, but we're going to do this carefully, and we're going to take care of each and every one of you so that this transition not only serves the country, not only serves the planet, but also serves you. And the United States, in doing this, needs not only to be participating in all of the things that I said, including permaculture, regenerative agriculture, it needs to be such a whole person's change. We need, in this area as in so many areas, for the United States to become a leader once again in doing the right thing.
Ben Jacobs from Jewish Insider, you've been critical of U.S. military intervention. Which times do you think the U.S. has intervened militarily in past decades, or some things that you approve of and things where the military was used correctly?
I wear hearing aids, and so I only heard about 50% of what he said. He's talking about U.S. military intervention.
You've been critical of U.S. military intervention. When do you think the U.S. has militarily intervened in recent decades where it has been appropriate and has been a good
There are three
use
things
policy?
which should be present in order for us to militarily intervene. Number one, a direct threat to our homeland. Number two, a direct threat to the safety or security of an ally. And number three, when the world order, the security and safety of the world order is being violated. I certainly think that the invasion of Iraq was an absolutely horrible transgression on every level, and we should not ever forget that the genesis of ISIS comes from that. I believe, however, for instance, this is not one that did happen, but one I think that should have happened during Rwanda. When after Bill Clinton left office, he made an apology and said that one of his sorrows and regrets was that he had not used military power to help the people in Rwanda, and I think I would have. I'm certainly not a pacifist, but I think that the use of the American military should be along the same core principle as all other public policy. I want public policy, both domestic and international, to be that which helps people thrive and which on a public level makes a stand for morality, democracy, and humanitarian values.
But in Yugoslavia or against the Taliban in Afghanistan, what do you think?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Taliban. This is the deal. Even before 2001, I was an American woman very aware of their brutality towards women. You know, the conversation about the Taliban and their brutality for women predated, even here in this country, predated 9/11. So when we sent troops to Afghanistan after 9/11, this was not illegitimate to me, and this was not inappropriate to me.
Should we have sent troops before that?
Pardon?
Should we have sent troops before that?
What before that?
Should we have sent troops before that?
Probably not. But I would have been, had I been president, very interested in ways that we could be of service. There are a lot of ways the United States can exercise power short of military intervention.
Hi, Mary Frances McGowan with the National Journal. I've been talking to folks who are on the ground combating the opioid crisis, first responders, healthcare providers, who are worried that the rhetoric kind of emphasizing holding drug companies accountable could potentially take away focus from plans to increase access to care for folks who are dealing with the opioid crisis. I just wanted to know if you could detail your plan to increase access to care for folks who are struggling with that.
So she said talking about the opioid crisis and the current sort of zeitgeist to hold drug companies accountable, maybe taking away from access to treatment and care for people who are actually suffering. Can you just talk about your
Let's be
plans?
really clear here. The United States has got to stop enabling and protecting Big Pharma. predatory practices on the part of big pharmaceutical companies, at what point is this going to stop? We now have attorneys general throughout this country who are prosecuting executives who are known to have practiced predatory terms in order to over-manufacture and allow for the overprescription of painkillers. We know this. These people are being prosecuted. And even now, it's fascinating to me watching the settlements that are happening and how basically small these settlements are compared to what they should be. The Sackler family alone. So I am really not sitting here playing a violin, really worried about what is happening to Big Pharma. Big Pharma has a very, very important function in this country. We need painkillers, but that doesn't mean we should just allow them to do whatever they want. For that matter, we need to fly, but clearly we shouldn't have allowed Boeing to just do whatever they want. There are a lot of areas, not just with the FDA, with the Centers for Disease Control, with the EPA, and with the FAA. We need to remember that these agencies were established to advocate for and protect the American people against overreach by corporate entities who, when unfettered by government regulation and serving only their own short-term profit bottom line, can hurt people. So no, I'm not concerned. I'm concerned for the larger issue of making sure that pharmaceutical companies are serving the American people before they are serving their own bottom line.
What about if the focus is on holding drug companies accountable, does it get taken away from treating people who are suffering from addiction?
No, name a way that it would. You never have to worry that doing the wrong thing, you having integrity, having legitimate regulation is going to hurt people. It's the lack of integrity and the lack of life-saving and life-serving regulation that hurts people.
Hi, Ms. Williamson. I'm Chrissy Clark with The Federalist. I was wondering if you had any actual dollar amounts on how much you plan to allocate towards your Department of Peace?
For the Department of Peace?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, the first thing we need to do is sit down and look at all these pieces. Because remember, a lot of it is coordinative. A lot of it isn't bringing in new things so much as is coordinating things that are already there. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it would cost much of anything. If we need to start with a number in terms of what we could go to and say, okay, we would have this space if needed, I see no problem with 2% of the U.S. Military budget. But I don't think anything like that would be necessary because, as I said, you're talking about changing power positions. You're talking about where money is spent more than you're talking about how much money is spent. But I think that you're going to be a lot better off spending money to cultivate peace. Excuse me, let me begin with where I was going, was you're going to spend, if you spend a lot more money cultivating health, you will spend a lot less money on doctors later. So if we spend more money on cultivating peace, we will have to spend a lot less money later on military adventures and, unfortunately, too often misadventures. You know, the American people need to wake up, smell the coffee, and stop pretending like we're children. This has to do with corporate profits. It has to do with corporate profits for huge multinational defense contractors. I wonder how many Americans know that the U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 B-21 Raiders. The B-21 Raider is an airplane that is a bomber, and of course you expect bombers to drop bombs. But these planes, each one of which costs $560 million, have an interesting, a rather unique characteristic. And that is that they drop not only conventional bombs, but also nuclear bombs. Now let me ask you, maybe I'm just dumb, I don't understand. Why do we need 100 airplanes that drop nuclear bombs? You drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it. You drop 10 of those, because remember, every nuke that exists on the planet today makes Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like a pinprick. You drop 10 of those, it's over for our species on this planet. So does anybody think that 100 airplanes at $560 million each that drop nuclear bombs are only an expenditure that is there to keep us safe? Are we that foolish? This has to do with the money of nuclear industry, and it is time for the American people to wake up, and I find it stunning that only 2 people in this race are even talking about these things.
Hi there. I'm Penny Starr with Breitbart News. To follow up on the opioid question, it seems like doctors are left out of the equation completely. Big Pharma is blamed, and we know there's the addiction and death. But what about the doctors? Because people can't have access to them unless they're prescribed. And real quickly on the Institute of Peace, the United States Peace Institute and HHS, those are already dedicated to peace and children and families. So why would you want to expand government?
Well, first of all, you talked about the HHS. What the HHS has is certainly agencies that help with working families and children. And you have the education department. It's really good that we have an education department, and it's really good that we have HHS. But how can anyone look at the facts? How can we look at the infiltration of the foster care system by the sex trafficking industry? How can we look at the fact that we have 3 million children that we know of who were violently abused last year alone? How can we look at the fact that 13 million children are hungry? How can we look at the fact that we have so many American children living in constant trauma due to the factors that I've mentioned here today and say, oh, well, we got to handle. HHS is fine and the education department is fine. Clearly, we need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children. And just like we put together the Department of Homeland Security, because we knew that there had been a tragic problem on 9/11 because the FBI and the CIA weren't conversing, we need a much more holistic view of what's going on, the threats and the vulnerabilities of America's children. And as president, I want to sit at a table with all of those agencies as well as all of the people, many of whom I meet throughout this country, who, as I said before, are social workers, early childhood educators. What you were saying a couple of moments ago about the doctors being left out, that's true as well with our policies regarding children. Teachers are left out. Social workers are left out. It's same is true with our trade agreements when workers are left out. This is all backroom deals these days, where a bunch of people who are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by corporate donations sit and talk to lobbyists and lawyers representing these multinational corporate entities, and they come up with policy. If I'm president of the United States, those days are over.
Hi, Nick Balsi, reporter with PJ Media News. I wanted to ask you about Democrats who've been making the case since 2016, since the election, that President Trump had no government experience when he came into office. How do you respond to Democratic voters who are possibly making the same case about your candidacy?
I don't see the problem with the president as his lack of experience. I see the problem to be his lack of ethics and his lack of visceral taste, apparently, for democracy itself. If the president had wanted to bring in fine experts, political experts and mechanics, he could have, and he didn't. And any that he even got close to the job, he got rid of soon enough. Let's remember, very experienced politicians took us into Iraq, and very experienced politicians agreed with the decision. Very experienced politicians took us into Vietnam. Very experienced politicians brought us here. We are naive to believe that all of these problems were created by Donald Trump. Rather, all of these problems created Donald Trump. We need to do more than just not go over the cliff. We need to get out of the vicinity of the cliff. And so the kind of experience that is represented by political expertise, while I admire it and respect it, and certainly see the need for it in any successful administration and governance, there's another kind of experience and another kind of qualification that I bring to the table that I believe is lacking in other candidates. Franklin Roosevelt himself, this is the president who led us through World War II. This is the president who brought us the New Deal and led us through the Depression. Hardly someone who didn't understand policies and plans. He said that the most important role of the presidency is moral leadership. He said that the administrative aspect of the presidency is secondary. Do we need political experts? The Democratic Party is filled with them, and of course we need them there. But in the president, we need more than a great car mechanic. We need someone who can discern what road we should be on, and that is what I bring to the table.
So my name is Amr Gohar. I am with 7D News. I'm here.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I want to go back to the Iran subject. Clearly, that the Iranian attacked the oil tankers in the Gulf area, and they attacked the Saudi Arabia. You mentioned that you will go back and sit down to the table and negotiate with them. President Obama, he did the best that any president could do. He sent them like airplane full of money. I think he said like $1.8 billion to the Iranian, and he was the easy as any president could be. And the result for that, they still work on the nuclear weapons and stuff. So I just want to hear from you, like, why you want to take it easy on the Iranians.
Normally how I would do this, but I'm not, simply because of the television cameras. I would normally be walking up to the person, and I would be able to hear you sing. So I'm sorry, I did not hear what that gentleman said. Can you tell me, Allison, please?
Yes, he asked about you saying that you wanted to sit down with Iran or get back into the Iran nuclear deal. He basically is saying that the President Obama was very easy on Iran. Iran then went and bombed Saudi Arabia and bombed oil tankers. So why would you want to go back and negotiate with them again?
Well, first of all, those bombings that you mentioned came after we exited the Iran deal. So there's no direct connection between our being in the Iran deal and those bombings. I think that President Obama and former Secretary of State John Kerry would admit that it wasn't as far as we would have liked to have gone, but it was the beginning. You know, when you're talking about diplomacy with other countries, particularly countries who are in many ways adversaries, you don't enter the room expecting to necessarily get everything you want, but you expect to get the best deal possible. And I think that that's what, there was pretty much of a worldly consensus among the Western allies and those who were part of that deal, that we got the best deal possible. And as I said before, the Iranians, for all we know, were complying with their part of it. What the president has done by leaving, this is what has destabilized the region more, including those bombings that you mentioned. Those bombings occurred after the president left the Iran deal.
Hi, Ms. Williamson.
Yes.
Emerald Robinson, One American News. I want to go back to what you said about moving away from fossil fuels.
Yes.
And that there's alternatives for these people in regions that are reliant on that industry. You said their creativity, their value could be used. There would be a way to find work for them. I'm from one of those areas. They felt like the Obama administration was very hard on them, and there wasn't economic opportunity presented as they went against fossil fuels. Clearly, Hillary Clinton did not help herself in West Virginia with her comments on it. They feel like people make these promises, say that we'll find you other economic alternatives. It's a very hard thing to do. I've talked to a lot of leaders in those regions about how do you do that? What are alternatives? And there's a lot of flowery language and hopeful talk, but let's take the coal region. Specifically, what is your idea for alternatives and how to create more economic activity for them?
First of all, your point is very well taken, but I'd like to deconstruct it if I might. First of all, in defense of Hillary Clinton, that line was so taken out of context. When she said we're going to take a lot of jobs away, you listen to the whole thing she said. She was talking about that as part of a larger conversation about what we needed to do. In terms of President Obama, and not just President Obama, but the left in general, I believe, and this is not just regarding the subject you mentioned, I think it's regarding a lot of things. There has been what has come across to many, many people, an arrogance and an elitism, and what has appeared to be a lack of concern for the short-term, for the collateral damage that might be experienced by thousands of people who need to put food on their table to feed their children. And I don't even think that they've come up with flowery language. I think they've come up with very perfunctory language that has made a lot of people feel dismissed. I'm not. Notice that I even said, one of the reasons I feel I'm the good person for the job is because I don't have this combative attitude so much as I have a cooperative attitude towards, as I said, industries that have done industrial scale harm, that we need to do industrial scale repair. You know, Martin Luther King said you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. Now, I led with the need. To me, when I talked to you about it just now, I led with that need. The American worker in every situation, whether it has to do with trade, whether it has to do with a just transition, or anything else, deserves to feel that the American people have their back. And I feel, even if, first of all, when you ask me what industries, there is so much money to be made. There are so many jobs to be created greening this country, whether it has to do with solar, whether it has to do with wind, whether it has to do with reforestation, whether it has to do with regenerative agriculture, whether it has to do with planning for floods, whether it has to do with wetlands and management. There are plenty of jobs. I don't think the issue is that there are not plenty of jobs. The issue is what you just said. And I'm very sensitive to the issue, and I think you're right. And that is a conversation on the part of the American president that we take managing this transition in a way, as I said earlier, is about change but not chaos. And I actually use the phrase tender respect. I feel that, and I believe that people hear you on the level that you speak from. And I think people hear me when I say that because I mean it.
Hey, Marianne, Matt Purdy, Breitbart News. Good to see you. Start the second debate. Would Hillary Clinton be a part of your Department of Peace? If so, or if not, why?
You know, I don't agree with Hillary Clinton about everything, but I don't want to be drawn into this piling on of Hillary Clinton that should offend every American woman.
Can I follow up on the earlier question regarding jobs? You want to continue?
Listen, let's not kid ourselves. Hillary Clinton is the person who said women's rights are human rights. Remember when she went to China and made that now legendary statement? Hillary Clinton has spent a lifetime working with issues around girls and women around the world. In fact, if anything, I believe that a mistake she made in her presidential campaign was that she didn't talk more about that. So even though I do not agree with Mrs. Clinton about everything, I was a passionate Bernie supporter. Although once the primaries were over, I absolutely supported Hillary Clinton. I was one of the first people to tweet in support of Tulsi Gabbard the other day. However, I think that all of us have a lot to be grateful for in terms of the service that she's given to this country, and particularly on issues of peace building, soft power, development of soft power. We can talk about other issues militarily, in terms of her tenure as Secretary of State, where I might not agree with her, and I do not agree with her, but we all need to be very nuanced right now. And we need to keep our conversation, all of us, on the left and on the right, need to do everything possible to return to honorable debate and honorable disagreement. And when it comes to Hillary Clinton, to me, she's a perfect example, where we agree, where we don't agree, but not piling on. It hurts every woman when any woman is made a target.
So do you lean one way or the other on that?
Pardon?
Do you lean one way or the other on the Department of Peace, including her?
If I am elected President of the United States, I will think long and hard about everything, including personnel.
Okay. I wanted to go back to the question about jobs.
Okay.
And we had earlier this week Andrew Yang here, and he talked a lot about the displacement due to artificial intelligence and automation. And he has proposed this universal basic income, which he described here as a way to give people the freedom and cushion so that if they aren't fully employed, they can find a way to move on. What do you think about that proposal?
I read his book, and he convinced me. I did more research having read that book, and he's absolutely right. We have a tsunami on the way. There are 9 states, for instance, in the United States, in which trucking is the primary industry. So let's say somebody's been a trucker for 4 decades. And then what happens is what, in fact, is going to happen. We're going to have driverless trucks. What is that trucker supposed to do? I mean, this is in industry after industry after industry. And the more you read up on this, the more you realize that a lot of us who might think, oh, well, my job couldn't be replaced by automation, don't kid yourself. You know, no person should live only for themselves, and no generation should live only for itself. We have such short-term thinking in pretty much everything regarding our public policy. We need to think about what's coming down the road 10, 12 years from now. That's why I agree with him about universal basic income. I'll tell you who else wanted a universal basic income, which is a fact that just blows my mind. Milton Friedman, the main articulator of trickle-down economics. He himself said none of this will be safe without a universal basic income. The idea of a universal basic income is not something new, and I agree with Andrew. Also, I want to say something else. I have mentioned here already today that I believe that all domestic and foreign policy should be built around the core principle: what would help people thrive? Tense, anxious, stressed people are not at their best. They don't have time and energy and bandwidth to be there for their lovers, for their friends, for their partners, for their children who want mommy or daddy to read a bedtime story to them before they go to sleep at night. They don't have the bandwidth or the energy to be there for their children and to really participate in family dynamic the way they might. They don't have the happiness and the stress-free ability to be good employers and to be good employees. This is the genesis of societal dysfunction. This is the genesis of societal malfunction. And malfunction is what happens when dysfunction has become so badly that you're talking about self-destruction here. So anything that helps people thrive allows people greater access to their own creativity and productivity. That's where money comes from. We need to throw away bad economic ideas that are holdovers from the 20th century. Money is not produced by a bunch of corporate aristocrats who drop crumbs from their table in the form of job creation. Money is produced by people spreading their wings, living their dreams, manifesting their God-given potential, being their creative and their productive best. That's when they start companies. This is why we should have universal health care. This is why we should have free tuition at state colleges and universities. This is why we should cancel these college loans. How many of these $1.5 trillion college loan debt, how many of those hundreds of thousands of people would love nothing more than to have access to $2,500 so that they could start their website and get all they want and get going? They just want to be part of the game, and we're leaving them out. So to me, anything that helps people thrive helps create peace and helps create prosperity.
Okay, we are now out of time. I know there are more questions. I think Ms. Williamson might be available to talk on the side if you need. But before you go, we would like to present you with National Press Club coffee mug.
Thank you.
It is a very, very highly sought after.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
being
so much.
here.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Thank you.